Okay, so the world is in a bit of a somber state, to say the least. Donald Trump has become president of the US for over 100 days, and he's basically turning the country into a shithole. Vladimir Putin has been invading Ukraine for as far as I know about 3 years, and it doesn't look to be that much of a success from his side. And at the same time, Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel has been committing a genocide against the Palestinians. So where does NATO really stand in all these conflicts? Well, before I answer that question, let me first tell you what NATO is and how they have formed and what they were actually supposed to be. So NATO is at least supposed to be a defensive alliance between the US and several European countries. When it started during the Cold War, with the Second World War over and Hitler dead, Russia and the US, formerly having been friends against a common enemy, have begun to grow a bit apart of each other over a clash of ideologies, mostly. And that led eventually to the formation of NATO by the US and Canada, together with Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the UK. In the most important part of NATO is Article 5, which says that if one country gets attacked in NATO by a non-NATO member state, all the other NATO countries have to intervene. It doesn't specifically say that the adversary has to be a non-NATO state. That was just the general assumption when Article 5 was written. An attack on one is an attack on all. In 1952, for various reasons as well, Greece and Turkey joined NATO. For as well as that, they have conflict among each other that they hope to be able to resolve, or at least prevent from escalating, because NATO is such a close-knit community. Later on, first West Germany lost its own occupations, became an independent country. That also joined NATO and became integrated into the US military complex. It was the first line of defense, mostly against a potential Russian or East Germany invasion, who, together with some other Eastern European countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and some others, including Albania, created the Warsaw Pact as a direct response, just in case. That off that sidetrack for just a little bit, because in the 1980s, Spain also joined NATO after Francisco Franco was ousted by natural causes, that is, but he was still ousted as a dictator. A democracy was set up, Spain joined NATO, and that was it. Until 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. A year later, the reunification treaty between East Germany, West Germany and the major Allied powers, the UK, the US, France and the Soviet Union, was signed, which reunified Germany into one country. This included East Germany joining West Germany. That might become important later on. One of the conditions was because that neither of the major powers was allowed to place military installations in the former East Germany. That didn't mean the rest of Eastern Europe, though. In 1999 started a wave of former Yugoslavia and former Warsaw Pact countries in the opposite order joining. Among others are Hungary, Poland, the Czech and Slovak republics after the Velvet Revolution, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which were actually former Soviet countries. And they didn't want to ever fall under a Russian country anymore. after the experience with the Soviet Union. And in 2009 came along Albania, which was the last of the former Warsaw Pact countries to join. In 2017, after a breakup with Serbia, Montenegro joined. And in 2020 came what we thought would be the last country to join NATO, which is North Macedonia. They were in a bit of a naming dispute with Greece, and that caused a bit of a delay of entry of international organisations. That was until Russia, who we thought of as a potential friend, and who could have joined NATO a couple of times, they didn't. In fact, they became an adversary of it immediately afterwards, thinking that it's more of an anti-communist alliance than the defensive organisation that it said it was. Because the new Russia had Vladimir Putin as a president since the 1990s, and he became more militarily aggressive, including against Georgia, and of course in 2014 against Ukraine as well. He started by annexing Crimea after the Maidan Revolution, which overthrew a puppet government. Then he supported pro-Russian separatist movements in the east of Ukraine, and in 2020 he started a full-scale invasion, which actually he thought would weaken NATO, but it didn't. In fact, 2 countries joined. Those were first Finland and then Sweden, with some doubts from Turkey about terrorist movements and stuff being resolved first. And that is how we end up with a total of 32 NATO, or North Atlantic Treaty Organization, member states today. And there's another rule in the NATO regulations: so every country has to be able to contribute to collective defense measures. And in the terms of the US, that always meant about 2% or more should be spent on NATO. That was on the first Trump administration. Before that, but after the Cold War, many countries started budget cutting because they thought, you know, the Cold War was over, we don't need that much anymore to defend and contribute. When Trump started calling for increase in spending, we thought it would never happen. But nowadays, more countries than ever have hit or surpassed the 2% mark. And the second Trump administration just decided to up that to 5%. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's because most that is going to be in armaments, which are mostly made in the US. You have things like tanks, munition, and advanced detection systems. Most of it's made in the US. So it's partly a lobby action, but partly it's a genuine concern about, you guessed it, Russia. And also Muslim countries. Back in 2001, I've got to remember, 9/11, never forget that. After that, the US declared a war on terror, which followed the, not exactly first, but kind of first that I'm aware of, NATO coordinated offences against foreign countries, which unveiled that NATO was not really there to have everyone defend each other. It was really just there to support US interests as well. So Afghanistan became the largest war ever in modern history. At the same time, operations in Libya and Syria to suppress dictators over there. Why? We suspect because the US was looking for oil in the area, of course. So later on, of course, that's now over, and so NATO's back to its default defensive state, right? Well, still kind of no. NATO, of course, NATO countries do have their own allies as well, which they do defend. And those are like Japan, like, thinking of another one, South Korea, some Southeast Asian countries. They used to be part of SEATO, but that failed. But also Ukraine is heavily, or at least was heavily aided by the US and NATO until the US dropped out of that with the second Trump administration. The interesting side effect though is that the NATO is only interested in defending itself and its allies, which can very easily be found over in Israel, the country that's almost constantly at war, including with itself. After attacks by terrorist organisation Hamas onto Israel, they decided to up their war efforts again and commit an almost genocide in Gaza. So even though this conflict doesn't directly compromise the security of NATO member states, NATO decided to support Israel in this genocide. Why the f*** is that? Probably because NATO is a big ally with Israel and we unconditionally support them, no matter what the f*** is going on there. So NATO is at the same time very defensive, but also a strategic offensive alliance in some areas of the world where they outright support potential wannabe dictators like Netanyahu in their pursuit to expand territory. What really makes that happen when they were initially supposed to just be, okay, we're all going to be here, we're going to defend ourselves in the event that the Soviet Union, nowadays it would be Russia or China, would come and attack one of us, right? Maybe NATO's mostly US first alliance, and the US was in its history very expansionistic with manifest destiny, including wars against Canada in 1812 and Mexico towards the end of the 1800s. And they kind of continue that spirit through NATO itself, trying to basically invade places where they could find oil. Maybe we've grown too sympathetic with the Jews and too antagonistic against the Muslims due to the Holocaust and, the war on terror, respectively. And when the Zionists over in Israel attack Palestine, we think of that, or at least the US military thinks of that, rather than as a violation of human rights, as, hey, at least we're getting rid of Muslim terrorism, so it's a counter-terrorist action, and they think that is justified, even though there are innocent people being murdered over there. So, does NATO, with the US in it, still have a right to exist? Well, of course, offensive alliances by themselves still do have the right to exist in a world in which there are still antagonizing forces like Russia, China, and maybe some Islamic Middle Eastern countries as well. You know? But at least they should change their focus from being America First organization to being a purely international defensive alliance. Maybe even just drop the words North Atlantic from the name and allow other countries that agree on upholding democracy and social justice join in as well. Maybe even have them be like an organisation that, instead of using the US as its main depository, having a depository in itself. For instance, like the United Nations, where you have the Secretary General, which is typically the depository for UN treaties. That's the place where most of the correspondence has to be approved. Because if the US holds such a powerful position, there may be a day that that country will abuse her power to control the other countries. Maybe that will become a video topic of its own, but with a little glossary about what NATO and all the controversy around it is about. Maybe I can touch briefly on the idea that the military is not even really needed in principle at all. With humans pretty much dominating the natural landscape, there are no non-human predators or other dangers that we have to defend ourselves against. The only thing that humans really defend themselves against is each other, and sometimes those other people will use their so-called self-defense against people they perceive as a threat, but are actually just minding their own business away from that person. Maybe instead of a defensive alliance, we should have a global agreement to disband the military, at least ban some of the most lethal and automatic weapons that humanity has ever built, completely, including further development. Maybe we should strive towards global open borders, so that rather than people trying to resolve conflicts with violence, they can just come over to the other country and be accepted, and also so that people develop less stereotypes towards other countries, which can be a cause for such a conflict, or historical causes. You just see another country for who they are instead of a part of you. But with that future of the NATO alliance and the military presence in general maybe out of the way for today, I hope to see you another time. Bye bye! I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do, please give a thumbs up and share this video with all your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.